Beletrina, živo.
Pozdravljeni. Pogovarjala se bom s škotskim pesnikom in pisateljem Johnom Burnsidom, avtorjem 8 romanov, 3 zbirk kratke proze in 15 pesniških zbirk, za katere je prejel tudi številne domače, britanske in mednarodne nagrade. Njegove izbrane pesmi so te dni izšle pri zbirki Beletrina. V tem kratkem predstavitvenem pogovoru z pesnikom in pisateljem Johnom Burnsidom pa se bom pogovarjala predvsem o njegovih pogledih na čas, v katerem živimo. Good afternoon, Mr. Burnside. I'm very much pleased you could be with us, even though it's only Zoom. It's not real analog presence. How should I put it correctly? How are you?
Well, I have to stay home because I'm not well, but I'm very well otherwise. I'm recuperating from an illness.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, you will not be with us for this year's Festival of Wine and Poetry due to, in your words, brush with mortality. It was not COVID-19 as suspected in beginning, but as you were saying, heart problems. I'm glad you are feeling better now and I can talk to you. And if you don't mind me asking, how do you remember those days in London hospitals with all that COVID pressure? I mean, is this still with you a lot or you try to suppress it?
No, actually, it was actually in my local hospital in Kirkcaldy, about 20 miles from my home. And, because I thought I had COVID and I tried to do self-isolation, etc., my problem developed even worse than it should have been. And of course, by the time I was in the hospital, they said I was going to die. So for that moment, it was very, obviously, I didn't know at the time. I told my wife that I was going to die. And he told me afterwards, that I almost died and I would have died, etc., if I hadn't been able to breathe by myself because of the machine was making me breathe. And I remember most of it very clearly. I don't remember the part where I almost died because I was apparently kind of unconscious. But I think, because what happened, coming so close to dying, and then leaving the hospital quite soon afterwards because they needed space. So I came home to recuperate. I had a very powerful sense of the immediacy of life and how important it was to enjoy each moment, to relish each moment, and to live each moment. And I know that's kind of cliche in a way, but it's really true. That you have that strong sense of, oh, I could have been dead, and I came close to this. I remember one moment in the hospital, I was unconscious, and I became conscious again, and I didn't know where I was, and I thought, is this dead? Is this what it's like to be dead? Of course it's not, because you don't. Anyway, so it was just that moment that stayed with me. That's the moment that stayed with me most. And so from then on, I really enjoyed my life. I don't have much. I can't go out, and I have to do lots of physio and take lots of drugs and rest a lot. But I enjoy each moment.
Life is something beautiful, basically.
Yes.
Well, your words from the new statement. If one thing comes out of this pandemic, it should be justice for all those essential workers who keep the world not only running, but more merciful than it would be otherwise. Pandemics is of course not over, but would you say there is a hope that this will truly be one of the results of this pandemic?
It's a hope, more than a belief. For many years, people have talked, in Britain, for example, and in America also, and other places, I'm sure, people have been talking about how people like nurses, junior doctors especially, ambulance people, paramedics, etc., they're like heroes, they're angels, all of these things. But I know from speaking to people that they don't even get paid as well as, anything like half of what they really need to live. And they're doing this very important work, and they're being paid quite badly. And everyone says, oh, great, you're such a hero. But it's really important that if you think someone's a hero, if you think someone's valuable, you should pay them for their work so that they can live a decent life, bring up their kids, and all of those things. So there's a pressure at the moment in Britain to try and get proper remuneration especially for example, nurses and junior doctors. And the government announced a plan, supposedly to help them. But in fact, if you look at the details of this plan, there's no new money. It's just a reassignment of money, so they're not really taking it seriously. So we have to keep pushing, we have to keep pressing, not just for health workers, but for fire workers, firemen and police officers and teachers in schools, everyone who does real work in the community, rather than investment bankers or advertising executives or whoever. They're fine, but they get too much. If you're really ill and you're lying in a gurney in a hospital and you think you're going to die, do you want a banker to come and save you, or do you want a nurse? Mm-hmm. A nurse is more important,
Correct me if I'm wrong, but looking from our angle, and Britain has always been, maybe one of the countries that we sort of, look upon as great, powerful, very interesting country. One is surprised when one reads the data about how neglected was British health service, not only now, but in, how financially neglected it was in the past years, even decades. I mean, do you understand this? Because, on one hand, Britain is perceived as such a strong, powerful, interesting country, and on the other hand, there are some basic things that are not sorted out.
In Britain, the biggest problem we have is the class system. There's a growing divide between people who are rich or very well off, and people who are not so well off, who are poor workers. I don't mean unemployed people. I mean workers who are poor, working people. And people who are in charge are all people who are privileged. I mean, over the last several years, ministers in Britain have been old Etonians, people from privileged families, people with money, many of them are millionaires. So either they don't know about the conditions that other people live in, which would be hard to believe because one can see them, or they don't care. And I think the truth is they don't care. It's more exaggerated in the United States, in fact. It's very clear right now that the United States, the polarization in the United States has become so extreme that something very, very serious is going to happen there. I don't think it's... Mm-hmm. We have to change things. We have to change things to...
Yeah.
Okay? You have to change things so that there's more representation of women, of people of color, of people from working class backgrounds. That's really important so that we have new perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Has coronavirus, I mean, you all the time you reflect the way society changes in your writing, of course. I mean, would you say that now this experience with coronavirus on the big scale, of course, it has affected you on a personal level a lot, but on a big scale, on national level, even European level, has it changed a lot the way you think about how society functions?
No, it hasn't changed anything but the way I think. It's illuminated for me the fact that there is not the will to do the important things that matter, especially with regard to environment. While I was ill, just before I went to hospital, I was actually sleeping in my, the room I'm in now, kind of sunny room. And I woke early in the morning, and the road outside my house, there were deer everywhere. Animals have felt free to roam much more generally than they usually do. And it was because there was no constant traffic of people coming through, etc. And it made me think, this is how it should be. Where I live, it shouldn't be constant traffic. There should be peace because, I live in the middle of nowhere. I live in the countryside. Wherever you go, there's cars. Wherever people are traveling by plane everywhere all the time for no reason sometimes. The environment is suffering during the epidemic, a pandemic, it's been very clear that because that hasn't happened, the pollution levels have dropped quite drastically, quite importantly. Animals have done well. Animals have returned to places where they weren't before, where they used to be, but had stopped going. These things have all happened, but as soon as it's over, as soon as they start lifting the lockdown, they'll get in their cars, they go off, they do this, they do that. I understand it because they don't know, they are not, it's not told to them how important it is to save the environment. The news doesn't cover it very well. Politicians pay lip service but don't do anything. The coronavirus at least partly can be put down to the way we behave with regard to environment. It's very clear that the reason why we're getting these kinds of epidemics is because wild animals are being forced out of where they normally live, are coming into built-up areas, are cross-infecting with domestic animals and with humans. This will continue. My current novel that I should have been writing while I was ill was all about a pandemic, and a book I published 2 years ago was about the dramatic effects of a pandemic on the world, where 80% of the population died because of a series of epidemics. This is caused by the way in which we're abusing the environment, directly caused by it. That's only one of the reasons, one of the causes of what we're doing, one of the results of what we're doing. There's also ocean acidification, there's global warming, of course, which everybody knows about, species loss, etc. These are all things that people know about, and yet there seems to be no political will to actually address them. But if we don't address them very, very soon, it'll be too late. So Corona gave us an insight into what it could be like and what it might be like if we don't do something very quickly.
Now the question is, what can we all, of course, do about it? You as a writer and poet, you are doing, really immensely a lot in this regard, from your poems, from your short stories, from your articles in different British and international magazines. There is constantly this concern for environment, and I do believe this definitely leaves mark on people. But what about those, things that normal people can do? Can you in Scotland, for instance, vote for serious, responsible Green Party that has an agenda, and clear agenda of what can be done in nearest future and in more distant future?
Well, there are Green Parties in the world, around the world, who are really seriously committed to making the right changes. Unfortunately, there are also Green Parties around the world who desire power or a share of power and will therefore compromise with business in certain ways. So, for example, most Green Parties' main focus now is on energy. The reason for that is because money is made generating new kinds of energy, and they will support anything which is classed as renewable energy. That means that they'll talk about things like biomass, which in most instances actually isn't making any positive contribution to changing the problem, to alleviating the problem. And in certain cases, wind turbines, very large wind turbines, situated in the wrong places, etc., those kinds of things. What we're doing is we're saying a very simplistic view of the environment, which says, oh, this is called renewable energy, therefore it must be good. It's not necessarily good. We have to make sure that it's efficient, that it doesn't interfere with the environment any more than traditional, conventional energy, etc. This is one area alone, but it's what they focus on, because business is interested in this because they can make money. They focus on, say, species loss. Business isn't interested in species loss because they can't make money out of that. So Green Parties tend not to, they pay lip service, they don't tend to emphasize this. Unless you can get a party or a group of people who are committed to deep ecology, the principles of deep ecology, and there's something to argue about there, but unless they can commit to those principles, we aren't going to make the necessary changes. There's a very good book by a writer called David Owen called The Conundrum. He says, It isn't that we don't know what to do to solve the problems. It is, do we have the will to do it? And that means people losing money. It means rich people losing money. So that's usually a game changer. That usually ends things. It means ordinary people have to make certain sacrifices. For example, look at any house. We try and run our house with a minimum energy use. But look at most houses, most offices, most buildings. There's a huge surplus of energy wasted in all of those buildings. I understand why, because people have got used to cheap or free energy, but we have to stop that. So that's one thing people can do. It's a small thing. But people think, okay, if I recycle my glass and I occasionally switch off a light, I'll save the planet. It's not going to happen. We have to pressurize the politicians. We have to stop buying products from businesses that are not supporting the environment. So one thing that ordinary people can do as consumers is to say, no, I won't buy this. This company isn't helping the environment. It's actually damaging the environment. I refuse to buy their product. If we organized ourselves, and again, this involves mass organization as well as individual choice, if we could organize ourselves as communities to say, we no longer will purchase this, or we will no longer be part of this group, or we no longer vote for this politician, unless they make a real commitment to environment, If we could do that, that might make a change. It has to happen very quickly.
I wonder, how do you, in this hectic life, manage to sort of live up to the high standards that you set up for yourself? I mean, our lives are pretty chaotic, the way we live, all the obligations we have. I mean, you have to have some time to, I don't know, to respect all the rules that you mentioned just now. How do you deal with it?
I think you can sit down for an afternoon and make the personal choices that you need to make in each person's own particular life. They can sit down and they can say, okay, where am I wasteful? Mm-hmm. What can I do? Where do I have influence? Who can I talk to? Imagine if I don't use social media. I have a very strong feeling against social media, like Facebook and things like that. Imagine someone has 20 friends on social media. If those friends are people that are not interested in the environment, they can maybe talk to them about things. They can maybe suggest things. They can maybe become a bit boring to their friends, but that's the price you have to pay. Many people I know, consider me very boring because I always talk about the environment. But some people listen. So you'll say, oh, I maybe talk about biomass to someone, and they say, oh, I thought that was a good thing. I say, well, it depends, and I explain what I know about it. And if we educate each other, we can all help each other to understand the bigger problem. Now, obviously, you'll meet resistance with that, but then you meet resistance for all kinds of things, mm-hmm. especially when you try to do something useful or helpful. So it isn't so much of an effort. People often feel that things are more complex than they are. But in terms of what you or I could do on a daily basis, it's not very complicated. We just simply go to a store. Instead of going to a large supermarket, maybe we go to a local store. We buy the products that we know are well sourced, that maybe we eat less meat.
Sure.
If everybody in the world who eats meat just stopped eating meat maybe twice a week, didn't eat meat for 2 days a week, or if they only ate meat twice a week, or maybe gave up meat altogether, that would make a huge difference to how we live. If you refuse to buy things that are in certain kinds of packaging, if you don't go to supermarkets but instead go to local businesses, if you go to farm markets, etc. These are all small things that people can do, but they add up hugely. If you support your local cooperatives, mm-hmm. Usually in most places there are cooperatives working where people are supplying food and products to each other, made in home domestic kind of conditions and stuff. I know there's a lot of legislation which gets in the way of that, but again, you can write letters, you can complain to your politician mm-hmm. about legislation which stands in the way of doing the right things.
Mm-hmm. You write with such respect about little things that we sometimes unfortunately hardly notice. About, I don't know, hazel leaves, about fox trails, about birds in this or other movement. I mean, Can you tell me, because you mentioned earlier the concept of deep ecology, how would you, in few sentences, explain the concept of deep ecology, the way you understand it?
Well, actually, I can explain it in 2 words, actually. There was a movement in the United States called Earth First, and that is really, those words are the principle. Anything we do, if it damages the earth, we should stop doing it. If it damages the forest, if it damages the lakes, if it damages the sea, if it kills animals en masse, earth first. So every time someone says, I want to build this or that, it should be subject to scrutiny by people who are knowledgeable about the terrain, about the local landscape, about the local bird life, water courses. People should be subjected to that. When I was objecting to a local development here where I live, I was told by the planning people that I could not object on the basis of environment, only on personal inconvenience. So for example, if I look out my window and I see something, and I don't like it, it doesn't look nice to me, I could object. If I look at something and I say, this is going to kill hundreds of birds, or poison the waterway, that is not a valid reason for objecting to a new development. And that is ridiculous. But that's the way the rules work in this country anyway. And it makes sure that ensures that ordinary citizens can't go up against businesses and developers and people and say, no, I don't care what it looks like, but I care that you're going to kill birds, or you're going to poison a watercourse, or you're going to destroy the soil structure of the land it's on. These are all the things we should be fighting all the time. So that's the simple answer. Earth first. If it damages the environment, it's damaging the lives of our grandchildren.
These are real and important issues that you are raising in this regard. But unfortunately, our world and also Europe is sort of is dealing with all sorts of things that don't even consider Earth as something that is in our focus. I'm talking about, shaky European Union, Brexit, Britain leaving, rising populism, not only in Eastern and Central Europe, but all over the continent. Would you say that, you were born in 1955, so you've experienced a lot of things so far, 70s, 80s, Margaret Thatcher, a Cold War. Would you say that this moment now is maybe one of the most dangerous and unpredictable times after the Second World War, or is this exaggeration?
2 things I would say that are really important right now. One is, what happens next to the United States is going to affect everyone, of course. They're the biggest military power in the world still, and if they get taken over by a dictatorship, which I don't rule out, we should all be very, very worried. Also, of course, the United States is one of the world's biggest polluters, so we have to worry about deregulation there. Brexit, the reason I was so angry about Brexit was, I know why Brexit happened. Anybody who's thinking about it knows why Brexit happened, and that had nothing to do with sovereignty. It was everything to do with deregulation. I lived through the 80s. I remember Margaret Thatcher, and I remember Ronald Reagan in the States and various other politicians deregulating labor and environmental and banking practices. These were all bad things that happened. And gradually the EU, which is not a perfect institution by any means, at least it reintroduced into Britain some regulation which protected at least some workers' rights, at least some of the environment, etc. I believe that the reason behind Brexit had nothing to do with identity or sovereignty or anything to that. That's just the window dressing. The real reason is to try to get rid of what regulation comes from the European Union, to get Britain back to how it was back in the good old days, when workers were paid very badly, when you could do anything to the environment you wanted, etc. This is the reason why Donald Trump, since he's been in power, has deregulated everything. He's been the worst, really seriously by a long shot, the worst president ever for deregulation. Beats Reagan hands down. The deregulation of environmental controls that were there has been completely across the board. It's completely disastrous. And while we've all been worrying about this or that and Russia and all those things. Quietly in the background, all of the regulation which would be introduced, even by Richard Nixon, has gone. So that's my biggest worry right now. We're being distracted by all kinds of important things. Of course they're important, but while we're looking over there, being misdirected that way, the people in power are just quietly erasing all the protection we have for workers, for the environment, for women, for people of color, for people, across the board.
I have to ask you, and this will be my last question, since you have recently written this marvelous book about the poets and poetry of 20th century and the way it reflects the many different realities of 20th century. What about this present moment? How do you think that the poetry reflects the enigmas of our time?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question because obviously poetry of the past is very easy to look back and sift out what really was the most powerful poetry of that time. And sometimes poetry that seems very topical in the moment doesn't really last very long, doesn't really have a long life. During the recent years, and one of the reasons I wrote that book was to try and see why, there have been poets all over the world who have been writing extraordinary new work. And I would say that at this time, it's just as rich and as strong as any time in the last century or so. You have fine poets in Eastern Europe and in Europe generally. You have some great poets in America, a few good poets in Britain, etc. Some great poets in the Far East. I couldn't talk about all of the people that I would like to have talked about in the book, but I tried to lead up to certain individual poets that I think are not only writing very fine poetry, but are addressing really complex and interesting issues. And I don't mean that simplistic way of identity politics or that kind of thing, which I don't find very interesting. You think a great poet like Terence Hayes in the United States, he's writing about being a black man in America today, a black poet, and a highly sophisticated thinker, but also experience day to day, every day, what it is to be black in America. And he's writing about that in extremely perceptive and nuanced ways. It's not that simple thing of, we've got a certain history of very worthy poetry, but not very much depth to it. This is a guy, I would call him a poet of genius. He's written a series of extraordinary books. So Terence Hayes, wonderful example of maybe not the most obvious American poet that people would go to, but certainly one of the best working today. Contrast to that, Lucy Brock-Broadway, who sadly died a couple of years ago, maybe I think one of the best poets working in my lifetime, because what she does is not so much directly addressing, say, political issues, or she does do sometimes, but what she's doing is she's insisting on the importance and the complexity and the innovation that can be done with language. I think one of the jobs of poets is to preserve the complexity and the power of language in the face of advertising and politics and, marketing and stuff, and military language, where they're trying to simplify, to break down the nuance of language. All that stuff about fake news and if it's complex, they want to ignore it. Poets, are the guardians of language. They're the guardians of the complexity of thought and language. So that was one of my emphases in the book. Not just poets who speak truth to power, which I tried to focus on as well, but also poets who couple that political concern with a concern for the nuance and the delicacy and the fragility and the treacherous nature of language as well. That's what I think is really important.
Thank you very much for this conversation and, of course, for your works that help us to lessen a little bit this noise of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Beletrina, o živo.